In 1991, a restoration team working on Spartacus reached a problem that nobody had encountered quite like this before. They had found a scene cut from the film before it ever reached theaters in 1960. 2 minutes of footage that had spent 31 years in a studio vault. The picture was intact. The camera negative had survived in good condition. One of the scene's 2 actors, Tony Curtis, was alive and willing to come back and re-record his lines. The other actor was Laurence Olivier. Olivier had died in July of 1989. He could not be asked. And so the restoration team did something that had never been attempted on a film of this scale. They hired Anthony Hopkins to reconstruct Olivier's voice to speak into a microphone. Lines that Olivier had spoken 3 decades earlier matched syllable by syllable to the movements of a dead man's mouth. Number 1 channel card. Spartacus began as a project Kirk Douglas built entirely for himself. Douglas had read Howard Fast's 1951 novel, a historical epic about a slave rebellion in ancient Rome led by a Thracian gladiator, and recognized in it the kind of material he wanted to control, not merely appear in. Through his own production company, Bryna Productions, he optioned the novel, hired the writer, assembled the cast, and retained final authority over the budget. In Hollywood in 1959, that degree of independent producer authority was unusual for an actor of any standing. Douglas had spent a decade building toward it and had no intention of giving it up. The budget was reported at around $12 million, placing Spartacus among the most expensive American productions of its era. Shooting would take place on the Universal backlot and on location in Spain, where thousands of local extras were assembled for the large-scale battle sequences. Douglas cast Laurence Olivier as Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Roman general and de facto power behind the Republic, Peter Ustinov as the slave trader Batiatus, Charles Lawton as the senator Gracchus, Gene Simmons as the slave woman Verinia, and a 24-year-old Tony Curtis as Antoninus, a poet-slave who begins the film in Crassus's household and ends it fighting beside Spartacus on the battlefield. The ensemble was one of the most distinguished assembled for a single production in that period. And almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Number 2. The director, who was already the second choice. The director Douglas originally hired for Spartacus was Anthony Mann. Mann was a seasoned filmmaker who had made a distinguished series of psychological westerns through the 1950s, Winchester 73, Bend of the River. The man from Laramie had recently moved into larger-scale historical productions. Douglas brought him on for Spartacus, and Mann began shooting. He lasted approximately 1 week. The precise account of what went wrong differs depending on who is telling it, but the broad outline is consistent. Douglas was dissatisfied with the direction Mann was taking the film's opening sequences, and he dismissed him. Mann moved on and would direct El Cid, another large-scale historical epic, the following year. He never gave a detailed public account of his experience on Spartacus. The replacement Douglas chose was Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was 29 years old. He had made 3 low-budget independent features and had recently completed Paths of Glory, a First World War film starring Douglas himself, which Douglas had deeply admired. It was that film and that admiration that got Kubrick the job. He arrived on a production that was already several days into principal photography, with an international cast he had not selected, a screenplay he had not developed, and a producer star who, by the commercial and contractual structure of the arrangement, outranked him on his own set. He directed the film through its principal photography, which included extremely demanding large-scale sequences in Spain. He completed it, and then, by his own later account, he found himself progressively excluded from the editing process. Number 3. The director who disowned what he made. In the years and decades following Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick made 11 more films, each of which he controlled with a degree of precision that became legendary in the industry. He never worked in Hollywood again after Spartacus. He directed from England for the rest of his career, built elaborate contractual protections into every subsequent production, and became known as perhaps the filmmaker most insistent on absolute final cut authority of anyone working in the latter half of the 20th century. He almost never mentioned Spartacus in interviews. When he did, it was to note its difference from everything else in his filmography, the one film he had directed that he did not consider his own work. He said, in words that have been widely quoted, that it was the only film he had directed where he lacked control over the final cut, and that, with the benefit of hindsight, he felt he should have refused to make it. Kirk Douglas disputed that characterization. Douglas maintained, in his own interviews and in his autobiography, that Kubrick had been given genuine creative latitude throughout the production and had exercised real artistic influence over the finished film. Douglas called the later disavowal unfair and chose a stronger word than that at various points. Two accounts of the same months of the same production, from two men who were both present for all of it. The historical record does not fully resolve which version is accurate, and it may be that both contain truth, told from the vantage of very different positions on the same set. Number 4. The writer Hollywood had tried to erase. The screenplay for Spartacus was written by Dalton Trumbo. In 1959, that sentence carried a weight that is difficult to fully convey today. Trumbo had been one of the most successful, most highly paid, and most admired screenwriters in Hollywood, prolific, technically gifted, commercially reliable until October of 1947, when he was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to provide names. He refused to cooperate, declined to answer questions about alleged communist affiliations, and was cited for contempt of Congress. In 1950, he was sentenced to prison. He served 11 months. When he was released, he found himself blacklisted, subject to an informal but effectively enforced industry prohibition that made it impossible for him to work in Hollywood under his own name. He kept writing anyway. That was the singular fact about Dalton Trumbo. The blacklist could remove his name from the screen, but it could not make him stop writing. Under pseudonyms, through frontmen, for substantially reduced fees, routed through intermediaries. He continued to work throughout the 1950s at a pace that would have been extraordinary for a writer with no restrictions at all. Roman Holiday, the 1953 Audrey Hepburn film that won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, was his work. The credit that year went to Ian McClellan Hunter, a friend who agreed to serve as a front. The Brave One, which won Best Original Story at the 1957 Academy Awards, was also his, submitted under the name Robert Rich, a name that corresponded to no real person. When the Academy sent word that Robert Rich had won and should come to collect his Oscar, nobody came. Trumbo retrieved the statuette years later. Number 5. The credit that broke the blacklist. Kirk Douglas hired Trumbo openly, negotiated the contract openly, and paid the fee openly. When the credits were finalized and the film was complete, the screen read, "Screenplay by Dalton Trumbo." It was the first time Trumbo's name had appeared on an American theatrical release in 13 years. At the same moment in 1960, the director Otto Preminger was also crediting Trumbo on Exodus, which opened the same year. The two films together made it effectively impossible for the industry to maintain the pretense that the blacklist remained operative. When Spartacus opened in October of 1960, the American Legion mounted picket lines outside theaters in several cities. The Legion objected to Trumbo's credit and called on audiences to stay away. Several exhibitors expressed concern. The studio weighed the situation carefully, and then, in what is widely documented as a significant symbolic moment, the President-elect of the United States, John F. Kennedy, reportedly crossed a Legion picket line to see the film at a Washington theater. Whether that gesture was deliberate or incidental has never been established with certainty, and accounts of it vary in their details, but its effect was unmistakable. If the incoming president could walk past a protest sign for a film with Dalton Trumbo's name on it, the blacklist's remaining institutional authority was effectively finished. By 1961, it had collapsed as a functioning mechanism. Individual careers still bore its scars, but the enforcement machinery had broken. Number 6. The scene itself. Which brings us to the scene. In Trumbo's screenplay, there is a sequence set in a Roman bath. Crassus, the patrician general and the dominant political force in Rome, is being attended to by Antoninus, the young poet slave he has recently acquired from Batiatus and installed in his household. Crassus initiates a conversation. He asks Antoninus whether he eats oysters. Antoninus says he does. Crassus asks whether he eats snails. Antoninus says he does not. Crassus reflects on this briefly and tells him that the matter is simply one of appetite, that some men prefer oysters, some prefer snails, and some, in his experience, prefer both. That, he says, is not a question of morality. It is a matter of taste. The metaphor is not heavily disguised. Crassus is telling Antoninus that he is attracted to men as well as to women, and that he has acquired Antoninus not merely as a servant but as something more specific, and that Antoninus, as property, is not in a position to decline. The scene is quiet and entirely controlled. Olivier plays Crassus with the ease of a man who has never in his life been required to ask permission for anything he wanted. Curtis plays the recognition that comes to someone who understands exactly what is being said and has absolutely no power to respond to it. It is a scene about appetite and power, about what it means to own something you also desire. Trumbo wrote it that way. Kubrick directed it that way. Olivier and Curtis performed it on a bath set at the Universal Studios lot in 1959, with the precision the material required. And then the Production Code Administration read the script, reviewed the footage, and required that it be cut. Number 7. What the censors required. The Motion Picture Production Code, the formal moral guidelines administered by the MPAA from the early 1930s onward and applied to American theatrical releases for more than 3 decades, was explicit in its restrictions on what it described as sex perversion. That term, in the code's language and in the interpretation applied by the Production Code Administration, encompassed any depiction, however oblique, of homosexuality or bisexuality. The snail and oyster dialogue, with its clear subtext, fell within that prohibition as the PCA read it. The demand was not a negotiation. It was a condition of certification. Without a PCA seal of approval, a film could not be distributed through major American cinema chains. The scene had to be removed. This was not a studio preference. It was a formal regulatory instruction issued by the industry's own censorship body. The footage was cut from the print before any general audience anywhere in the world could see it. Number 8. What the scene meant without itself. The snail and oyster scene was not the only material the Production Code Administration required to be removed from Spartacus. Several of the gladiatorial combat sequences were trimmed for violence. Other small adjustments were made throughout, but none of the other cuts carried the same narrative consequence. The violence cuts shortened scenes that were already structurally complete. The removal of the bath scene removed information about who Crassus was, information that the rest of the film depended on, whether the audience consciously recognized it or not. Without the scene, Crassus is a skilled and ruthless political antagonist, defined by ambition and the appetite for power in the abstract. With it, he is more specific and more dangerous. A man for whom the sense of absolute entitlement extends to human bodies, and who has encountered, in Spartacus, the one thing he has ever wanted that refused to acknowledge being owned. His later obsession with hunting Spartacus personally, with refusing to delegate the task to subordinates, with insisting on a confrontation that serves no obvious strategic purpose, all of that is more legible with the bath scene than without it. Without it, the obsession is a character choice made in the editing room. With it, it is a conclusion that follows logically from what we have already seen about who Crassus is. Number 9. 31 years in a vault. The footage was not destroyed. Universal retained the original camera negative of the snail and oyster scene alongside the other trimmed material. It sat in the studio's archive for 31 years. The production code itself had been abandoned by the late 1960s, replaced by the rating system. The cultural context that had made the scene unacceptable had entirely transformed. The content of the sequence, A veiled suggestion of bisexuality between two fictional characters in ancient Rome would not have attracted regulatory objection from any American institution by the time the 1980s arrived. But no one had yet been given the mandate or the budget to go back into the Spartacus archive and look for what had been left behind. In 1989, Universal finally commissioned a full-scale restoration of the film. The project was led by restoration producers Robert A. Harris and Jim Katz, who had previously overseen the restoration of Laurence of Arabia and had the technical experience to handle a project of this complexity. The assessment of the original materials proceeded, and the news was largely good. The original negative was in significantly better condition than many films of its era. The picture elements of the snail and oyster scene were found to be intact. The magnetic soundtrack, however, was a different matter entirely. Number 10. The restoration and the problem. The original audio recording of the snail and oyster scene, the magnetic track on which Olivier and Curtis had spoken their lines on the Universal soundstage in 1959, had deteriorated beyond the point where it could be restored or transferred with acceptable quality. The picture was recoverable. The voices that belonged to it were not. Tony Curtis was alive and in good health. He was contacted by the restoration team. He reviewed the footage, and he agreed to come into a recording studio to dub his own voice back over his own younger face. Sitting in a booth, watching himself from 30 years earlier on a monitor, he re-spoke his lines in synchronization with the lip movements he was seeing. His half of the problem was solvable. Laurence Olivier had died on the 11th of July, 1989, less than 2 years before the restoration was completed. His half of the problem was not solvable in the same way. The restoration team, working in consultation with the Olivier estate and with Universal, approached Anthony Hopkins. Hopkins was at that point one of the most prominent Welsh actors in British theater and film, and had known and worked with Olivier during his years at the National Theatre. He had an extensive familiarity with Olivier's voice, its cadences, its particular precision of articulation, the patrician vowels, the way Olivier shaped the line so that the important word always arrived exactly where it should. Hopkins agreed to take on the reconstruction. He studied footage of Olivier's performance in Spartacus at length. He worked with the restoration team to match his delivery not merely to the sense of the dialogue, but to the precise shape of Olivier's mouth as it formed each syllable on the picture track. And then he spoke Crassus's lines into a microphone, and they were laid against the image of a man who had been dead for 2 years. What exists in the restored version of Spartacus is a scene performed by Laurence Olivier and Anthony Hopkins, in which only one of them was alive when the restoration was made. Number 11. What the scene means in the film. With the scene restored to the film, Spartacus reads differently. The change is not cosmetic. Crassus's behavior in the film's second half, his insistence on taking personal command of the campaign against Spartacus, his refusal to remain in Rome and manage the political situation while others handle the military one, his need to be present at the outcome carries a psychological weight it cannot quite carry without the bath scene. We have seen what Crassus does with desire. We have seen that he does not distinguish between categories of appetite. Spartacus is the slave who declined to be his possession. That refusal is not merely a political rebellion against the Roman state. In Crassus's psychology, as the bath scene establishes it, it is something considerably more personal than that. Trumbo wrote that connection deliberately. Whether Kubrick recognized the full implication of it, he directed the scene without being able to guarantee it would remain in the film is a question the surviving record does not settle. What is clear is that the censors who demanded its removal understood precisely what it was doing. They saw the scene, they understood its subtext, and they required it to be cut. In a way, that is the most attentive, critical reading the scene ever received, at least in 1960. Spartacus is a film that was censored before anyone could see it, disowned by its director, and credited to a writer the industry had spent 13 years attempting to erase. Its most consequential scene, spent 31 years in a vault, was partially reconstructed with a borrowed voice, and now sits in the film as though it had always been there.